Hello everyone, welcome to my video tutorial on Git and GitHub for beginners. So this is a beginner series to get started with Git and know and understand about the Git configuration and basic Git commands. I'll cover an advanced series in the next tutorial. So let's get started. First, let's understand version control. So version control is the practice of tracking and managing any changes to the code. So version control software, it keeps track of every modification in the code in a special kind of database, and if a mistake is made by any developer, they can turn back the clock and compare the earlier version of the code. That helps them to roll through the earlier version and help fix their issue. So it facilitates collaboration and contribution among developers because every member can have their own copy of the code in their local machine, and it's called branching feature. We'll discuss about it in a bit. So the tools that help facilitate version control are called version control system. They are also called source code management SCM or revision control system. So now let's understand Git. Git is the most widely used version control system, and it's an actively managed open source project. So in Git, we save an initial version of code, and then when we update it, we can save the new version again into Git, so that we can look back at all the changes we have made over time. And this will help us to go back to the previous version if we need to track any bug. So one of the biggest advantages of Git is its branching capabilities. So let's say you have a main code and then you can create a feature branch out of it. You can work on the feature branch, you can add features to the code, and then finally when it's done, you can merge it to the main branch. So developer can have their own feature branch that is cloned from the main master branch. So this ensures that the main branch always contains production quality code and we don't have to mess with the live production code. Each developer gets their own local repository that is full with history of commits. So this distributed development creates a more reliable environment. It also allows pull request. So in short, pull request is the method of submitting contributions that you made to the project. So it's an event where contributor, that means anyone who is working on the code in their local repository, they ask the maintainer of the Git repository to review the code and that they want to merge it in the main project. So if you are not the owner of the project, you can make the modifications in the code locally, but you cannot push it to the main master branch. To do that, you have to have a pull request. Now let's talk about Git versus GitHub. So as we discussed earlier, Git is a version control system that helps you manage and keep track of your source code history, whereas GitHub is a cloud-based hosting service where you can keep your Git repository. So it lets you manage the Git repository. There are other alternatives like Atlassian Bitbucket or let's say GitLab, and you can choose any cloud hosting service based on your requirement or based on your company's requirement. And now let's look at the basic Git workflow. So you will host your Git repository in any cloud service provider. For this case, I chose GitHub. Then you clone the repository from the GitHub to your local laptop or your local machine. And that local machine will have Git installed. Git is the version control system. And then you make modifications into that code and you add any new feature to the code. After that, you want to stage that change with git add command. Then you commit the changes that you made or that you staged using git commit. After that, the final thing that's left is to update that code or push that code to GitHub. Till now, you made the change, but the change is still in the local repository in your laptop. Then you push the code with git push command and the updated code is in GitHub. So let's say there were some modifications made by other developers to the repository that you were working on earlier. Then you would need to update your repository in your laptop because your laptop are missing some valuable changes made by other developer, and you can update your local repository by submitting a git pull request. So git pull will pull down the latest and greatest tags or updates that are made by other developers in the repository. So this is the basic Git workflow. Now we'll look into setting up GitHub, and I'll talk about a Visual Code Studio, which is a code editor as well. So let's look into that. So signing for GitHub account is pretty simple. You just go to github.com and click on sign up. Then you pass your email and it will ask you to validate the code that it sends in the email. You just put in that information and your GitHub account is ready. It's that simple. So since I already have a GitHub account, let me log into that account. Once I sign in, it gives me this base page or the main page. Then I can click on new to create a new repository. Let me do that. Give it a name, demo, techie, and travel. Let me give it a description of demo for Git, and then I'll set it to public. And for now, I'll create a repository. Now, as you see, my repository is created and I can work on pushing my code into the repository. Now, you have a GitHub account and you have a place or a repository where you can push your code. But the other thing that you need to understand now is to have your local workstation set up. Let's do that. Depending on whether you have a Windows operating system or Linux operating system, you can install Git on your local machine. So first, let me look into how to set up Git for Windows. You just visit this page gitforwindows.org and click on download. It will download the Git executable, and like the other normal installation, just double click on it and install Git. So during installation, make sure to click on the Git bash. I'll show it in a bit. So my download is complete. I'll double click on that downloaded file. I'll click on next, and this is what I was talking about. Make sure to click on the Git bash because I find Git bash more useful than the normal Windows command prompt, because with Git bash you can type in the Linux based commands as well. So just click on next and you can choose the default option and let it install. Now you have Git bash installed on your system. You can search for Git bash and click on Git bash and open the system. As you see, I am in my Git bash prompt now. If you have a Linux based operating system, then installing Git is a simple one-liner command. For Ubuntu or Debian based distros, you can type in apt-get install git and press in enter. Or for the Fedora or Red Hat based systems, you can type in yum install git. To check the version of Git installed on your system, you can type in git ---- version. So it shows that I have a Git install version 2.25.1. That's similar to using it on the Git bash on Windows. So if I open the Git bash for Windows, I can still type in git ---- version and get the version of Git installed on my Windows machine. So you can either use Git bash for Windows, or if you have a Linux based system, then you will use Git on the bash terminal. So first thing after installing Git is I want to check my global config. I can type in git config -l to check the config, and I don't see any username or the global email configured for my GitHub account. I want to clear the screen first. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to configure the global configuration email and username. So let me do that. I can type in git config ---- user dot name to techie travel, and then I can type in global user email to techieandtravel@gmail.com. So this is the email that is associated with my GitHub account. You might be wondering why the need is to set up the username and global config email. So these details will be associated with any commits that we'll create in the future. So now if you type in git config -l, you will see that the username and email is set to the one that you inputted earlier. Now we have Git set up on our local machine, but our local machine and our GitHub account, they are not connected. So in order to push the code to your GitHub account, you have to prove to Git that you are the owner of the account. So you have to connect your local machine to GitHub account somehow. So the way this is done is by using SSH key. SSH key is an access credential for SSH network protocol. So it helps in authentication and encryption, so that when you connect to the remote servers or remote accounts, it provides a secure mechanism. So basically you can use it for any remote file transfer, any remote system access, network management, etc. And SSH, it uses a key pair to initiate a secure handshake between remote parties. It contains a public and a private key, and to generate a key pair, type in SSH keygen and provide the encryption with -t flag, and then provide the strength of encryption with -v flag, and then with -c flag associate your email account. So I'll choose the default path, and then you'll be prompted for a passphrase. This is for additional layer of security. So you see that my SSH keygen created the public and private key. If you noticed earlier, this is the path where your private and public key are stored. So let's check that with ls-la command under home take and .ssh folder. So if you see, .pub is the public key and id.rsa is the private key. So you can think of this private and public key as a lock to your door and the key to open it. So public key is basically the lock to your door, and id_rsa is the key that you can open the lock. So you can put this public key or the lock in any remote servers or in your GitHub account for this specific case, and you can unlock it with your private key, which is id_rsa. So once you put this public key in your GitHub account, this private key is the proof that only this private key could generate this public key, and you are the legit owner of the account. So now that we created a public and private key, we need to make sure that our local machine Git command line knows about the key we generated. So we need to add the new SSH key to the SSH agent. So SSH agent is like a keygen, and it is responsible for holding our private key. So let's make sure that SSH agent is running by typing in this command. We see that it is running. So now we are going to add SSH key to the local SSH agent. We can do so by using this command under our home take.ssh and id_rsa. Now we added SSH key to the local SSH agent. Another thing that we'll do is we'll copy this public key and place it in the GitHub. So let me cat this public key. I'll copy this and go over to my GitHub account. You click on this profile and click on settings. Then you click on the SSH and GPG keys. Then you can click on new SSH key. You can give it a title, say demo git, and then paste your key that you copied earlier. Now your GitHub account holds the public key and your local Git CLI holds the private key. So you can connect your local CLI with the GitHub account. Now we'll see how to set up a repository. The first thing to do is to initialize a new repository. So to create a new repo, you can use mkdir command and create a, let's say, test demo. I can go under test demo, and to initialize you can use the git init command. So when I type git init, it initializes the empty repository that is located under my home folder in a directory called test demo. So I'm in test demo right now. So when you initialize it, Git saves the configuration under the .git subdirectory, and it has this configuration that you can make modifications to. So you can use git initialize to initialize a completely new directory from your local machine, or another way is to clone an existing repository that is already existing in the GitHub account. So what I can do is I can just go to my GitHub account and clone this repository that I created earlier. So I'll click on SSH and just copy this line, and I can go to my machine and use Git Clone to clone the repository. So it will ask for the passphrase that I supplied when creating the SSH key pair. So now I have this demo techie and travel in my local repository. So if I cd into it, I'll see that I have this demo techie and travel. And since this is already initialized, it will have this .git repository where it will have this config file that has information on the branch and the remote URL. But let's say you have tens and thousands of repository in your local machine. It's difficult to keep track of the branch that you are working under. And remember, we should never be working on the production branch or the main branch directly. If you see here, my current branch is master. So should I make modifications in this, I should never be working on the master branch. But it's difficult to always go inside the Git directory and check the config to make sure that you are in the correct branch. So for anyone working with Git, I have a documentation in my blog. You can click on this version control with Git and if you scroll down at the bottom, you have this segment. Just copy that and make changes to your bash rc. Use your favorite editor. I'll use vi, and I'll just vi bash rc. I'll go to the section where it has the alias, and under that I will copy this exact line that I copied from my blog. I'll just save it, and after saving it I will type in source to source the change that I did. So if I go one step back, now I don't have to go inside the .git config to check which branch I'm in. It will list the branches that I'm working under. I would recommend setting this to anyone that is working on Git. Now we can ls and see that we don't have anything in here. I will create a test file readme.md, and let me type in some content in here, a demo repository, and let me save it. Now if I do git status, so this git status will show you all the changes you made but that aren't tracked. So to track it and to make sure Git understands the change that we made, we just type git add readme specific file that we created, or there is an easier way to do it. You can just type in git add -a. This will track all the changes that you made. If you have more than one change, then it's easier to pass in this -a. Now if we type git status, it is tracked. Now it shows a message that the change is ready to be committed. In order to commit this, we type in git commit command, and with -m flag you can type in the commit message. So make sure to always keep a commit message that is relevant to the change that you made. For this specific, I will type in added readme. So now you can see that it is committed with one file changed and there is one insertion in the file. So now I know my remote is origin and the branch that I'm in is master. So even though I said earlier that you should never be working on the master branch, we'll take a look at branching in a bit, but for this specific case, since it's a demo repository, I worked on the master branch and I'm committing it in the master branch. So now that you tracked it and now that you committed it, the only thing that is left is it to push to the remote repository. So now if you go to the remote repository, you'll see that you don't have that readme.md file that you created in your local repository. So we can use git push command to push the code to the remote repository. So if I do git push, since my remote is origin and my branch is master, it will ask me for the passphrase. If I type in my passphrase, now you see that my change that I made in the local machine is pushed to the remote repository. Now let me go to the GitHub and refresh it. Now you will see that you have this readme.md, and if you click on it, you can see that it has this message, a demo repository that we worked on earlier. Now if you see, it has a commit and it has this hash in here, right? So if you click on the commit hash, you will see that there is one addition. So this plus sign signifies that there is an addition, and if you deleted it, then it would show a minus sign. So let us do that. But one thing that you noticed is if I go to my repository, you see that there is a commit message as well, added readme.md that we passed in earlier. Now what if I go to the same repository and I update this readme.md, and then I delete this old file, I add one space, and I'll say a test demo. Let me change the message, and if I do git status, I'll see that I have one untracked file. I can do git add -a to make sure that it's added and it's tracked. If I do git status, I'll see that it's ready to be committed. Now with git commit message, I can provide a modified readme.md so that this is relevant to the change that I made, and then with git push origin master, I can push in to the remote repository. Now let's go to my remote repository. Now you see that the second message, modified readme.md, shows up, and the modified message a test demo shows up. So you see that you have two commits now. So this is the version control that I was talking about. So the first commit that we made was 3 minutes ago, which we added add readme.md, and then we modified in the second instance. So if you click on this hash or this modified readme.md, now you can see that with the minus sign in here, we removed the initial commit that we had when we committed it for the first time, and with the plus sign, this is the content that we added in the readme. Second time we pushed it to the remote repository. So this is how you can work on the Git repository in your local machine and then make changes to the repository and push it to the remote repository. Now we worked on the repository that was cloned from the remote repository. What if we want to initialize this repository on our own? So let's say we create a folder mkdir my new test, and we go under my new test and we want to initialize. Since we haven't initialized it at all, it says that it's not a Git repository. So to initialize this completely new repository, we type in git init. This will initialize it, and as I said earlier, it will create a subdirectory .git, which you can check for config file. So it does not have any information about the remote branch or nothing, unlike in the older config where it had information about the remote repository, remote URL, and the branch. It does not have anything because it's a completely fresh repository, and the Git that is in your local machine or the command line interface has no idea about the remote repository. This means we made a fresh repository and we have no remote repository to push our changes to. So we'll need to update our local repository with a mapping. So we'll create one in GitHub and then we'll map it to the remote URL. So let's say we create a new repository. Let's go in here and click on new. I'll say my new demo and new demo and then create a repository. So if you see here, GitHub already provides us the remote URLs. So you can copy this line and go into your Git command line interface. If you do git remote -v, it does not have any information whatsoever. So what you are going to do is you are going to paste the line that you copied earlier. And then now if you type in git remote -v, you'll see that you have a remote repository that is mapped to the git initialized repository in your local directory. Now let me clear this and look into the git config. Now you see that it has this information on the remote URL. And now adding a new file, committing it, staging it is pretty much similar to what we did earlier. As I said earlier, it's not a good practice to work or make modifications directly in the main branch. So what we can do is we can go to our repository, and what we can do is we can check for the branch. We see that right now we only have master. We can do git branch and type in feature new test, and if you do git branch, you will see that we have a new branch. So we can check out that branch, feature new test, and you see that it switched to the branch feature new test, and our bash prompt made sure that it is updated to feature new test. And another thing that I want you guys to know is about the code editor that I really like. So you can go to this visualcodestudio.com and download the Visual Code Studio. It's available for Mac, Windows, or Linux. So this is a cool text editor that you can use to work with the code repository for Git. We'll cover this more in the advanced tutorial section, but just go ahead and download it and install it in your local machine. So this is it on the basic Git setup and understanding how you can create a GitHub account and how you can work on Git. And in the next tutorial, I'll be covering the advanced Git. So stay tuned. Thank you.